So you people are able to see the slides?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Put on the PowerPoint mode. It is seen.
Sure. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Niharika, practicing as an intensivist in Bangalore. So we are into 3 hours discussion, but I'm sorry to tell that more than half of the topics are still remaining. So we'll try to make it fast and crisp. So the next important topic is regarding hepatorenal syndrome. So the outline of the topic would be, sorry, 1 minute. So the outline of the topic would be the definition, what is the diagnostic criteria, the classification of HRS, the older and the newer classifications, the pathophysiology, the risk factors, and the management. So coming to the previous year questions, the actually HRS is asked recently in all the DRNB question papers. So in 2023, the HRS diagnosis and management was asked for 5 marks, and in the 2022 DRNB, the pathophysiology of HRS. So coming to the introduction, what is HRS? So it is a serious complication of end-stage cirrhosis and portal hypertension, which is characterized by increased splanchnic blood flow, a state of decreased central volume, decreased renal blood flow, and decreased GFR. So it is typically diagnosed when there is a marked reduction in GFR in the absence of any intrinsic kidney disease, such as hematuria, proteinuria, or abnormal kidney ultrasound. So coming to the classification. So when I was taking for an FNB examination, this was the classification which I knew. So it was basically classified as HRS type 1, type 2, but there is also HRS type 3 and 4. So HRS type 1 is nothing but a cirrhosis with a rapidly progressing acute renal failure. Type 2 is cirrhosis with subacute renal failure. And type 3 is which is superimposed on a CKD or a acute renal injury. Type 4 is fulminant liver failure with HRS. Now, these are the older diagnostic criteria which was proposed by International Ascites Club. So 1996, 2007, and 2015 criteria. Okay, so now the recent criteria is the which was actually modified in 2023. So this is the one. If they ask, please tell hepatorenal syndrome or write it as HRS AKI and HRS NACI. So this HRS1 was treated as HRS AKI here, where there is an absolute increase in serum creatinine of greater than 0.3 mg per dl in 48 hours, or an increase in greater than or equal to 50% in 3 months. And the remaining is the older one only. No response after volume expansion with albumin, cirrhosis with ascites, absence of shock, no current or recent use of nephrotoxic drugs, and any absence of parenchymal kidney disease. Now, what is HRS2? Also known as HRS non-AKI, and it's been divided into two: HRS acute kidney disease and HRS CKD. Now, coming to the stages of AKI. So, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, it is same as the KDIGO criteria. So, but the stage 1 is divided into stage 1A and 1B. So stage 1 is increase in serum creatinine of greater than or equal to 0.3 mg per dl, or increase in serum creatinine of greater than 1.5 fold to 2-fold from the baseline. So 1A is greater less than 1.5 mg per dl, and 1B is greater than or equal to 1.5 mg per dl. Stage 2 is at least 2-fold to 3-fold increase in the from the baseline creatinine level. Stage 3 is at least 3-fold from the baseline, or an absolute increase in greater than or equal to 4 mg per dl, or a patient who requires renal replacement therapy. Now, important is pathophysiology. They've asked for 5 marks. So what you need to write is this much. So basically, the pathophysiological hallmark of HRS is vasoconstriction of the renal circulation. This sentence should be present. Okay, this sentence actually carries 1 mark. Now, the remaining is what is the major pathophysiological mechanisms. So first one is circulatory dysfunction. Second one is nitric oxide dysfunction. Third one is systemic inflammation. So if you write this, you might get 1 more mark. And when you put this diagram schematic representation, you might get the other 3 marks. So coming to the diagram. So advanced cirrhosis leads to cirrhotic cardiomyopathy. So when syndromic cardiomyopathy occurs, there is decreased cardiac output, which may lead to effective arterial hypovolemia. So when this occurs, there is activation of the vasoconstrictor factors like RAS, SNS, and vasopressin, which leads to renal vasoconstriction, leading to decreased GFR and the HRS. The second mechanism is, which I told, the nitric oxide dysfunction, which occurs due to portal hypertension. So what happens in portal hypertension? There is release of vasodilator mediators like nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, and endocannabinoids, which leads to splanchnic arterial vasodilatation. And this leads to decreased vascular resistance and subsequently the decrease in effective arterial hypovolemia. The third mechanism is the systemic inflammation, which leads to two things: release of the PAMs and the DAMs, which lead to inflammatory response, leading to the release of inflammatory mediators like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and endothelins, which also leads to splanchnic arterial vasodilatation and subsequently arterial hypovolemia. Now coming to the risk factors. So the major risk factors are spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, any systemic infections, depends on the severity also, large volume paracentesis that is greater than 5 liters with inadequate albumin substitution, any nephrotoxic drug use, bleeding from esophageal varices, post-tips, and diuretic treatment. Coming to the treatment of HRS. So if you write the schematic diagram, it would be a better thing. So you have done a workup and management of AKI. Any patient who is presenting with AKI, you have done all the workup, and you have seen that there is an acute increase in serum creatinine of greater than or equal to 0.3 mg per dl. After that, you're going to stage the AKI. Okay, stage 1A or stage 1B to 3. So if it is an AKI stage 1A, so what you do is you just do a close monitoring, do a risk factor management, and treat any infections, and do plasma volume expansion with IV fluids. If there is a resolution, then you do some surveillance. If not, then you have to do the same management as in AKI stage 1B to 3. So what is there? Here also you do risk factor management, treatment of all the infections, and you do plasma volume expansion with albumin here. The dose has already been mentioned by Dr. Bhuvaneshwari. So if there is a resolution, then you do the surveillance. If not, then you have to see the criteria for HRS AKI. Okay. If the criteria fulfills, then we have to give vasoconstrictor therapy along with albumin. If it doesn't meet a HRS criteria, then you have to consider the renal replacement therapy. So what are the important medical managements in HRS? There are two things. One is vasoconstrictors. Second one is the albumin. So we'll just go into the detailed treatment. So what is the rationale to use this vasoconstrictors? Basically, it is used, to counteract the splanchnic arterial vasodilation. Okay, so what is the most common drug that is used is terlipressin. It is a drug of choice. Okay, terlipressin is a synthetic vasopressin analog with a predominant vasopressin 1A receptor effect, and it primarily acts as splanchnic vasoconstrictor. So what is the dose? You usually give a IV bolus dose starting at a 0.5 to 1 mg every 4 to 6 hours. And dose can be increased to a maximum of 2 mg every 4 hours in case of non-response. So what is non-response? It is defined as less than 25% reduction in serum creatinine level after 3 days and no side effect occurs. What are the adverse side effects with the terlipressin? It causes diarrhea, abdominal pain, myocardial infarction, intestinal ischemia, and respiratory failure. Contraindicated in coronary artery disease and peripheral vascular disease. So if there is any contraindications, then the other drugs which you can use is norepinephrine, which is nothing but a systemic vasoconstrictors, which acts through the activation of alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. The dose here is 0.5 to 3 mg per hour, continuous IV infusion. How do you titrate the dose? To achieve an increase of 10 mmHg in MAP. They also tried a combination of midodrine and octreotide also, when other two are contraindicated. This is only the case reports which are there. Now coming to the albumin. So albumin is often administered in combination with vasoconstrictors to counteract the reduction in the effective arterial blood volume and improve the cardiac contractility. So recommended dose, as Bhuvaneshwari told, it is 1 kg, 1 gram per kg per day for 2 days, followed by 20 to 40 grams IV once daily. Maximum you can give for 14 days. What is the mechanism of action of albumin in HRS? It increases the systemic vascular resistance and cardiac output. It has both antioxidant and anti-inflammatory actions, which helps in mitigating the inflammatory state associated with HRS. And it is able to bind to a wide range of substances, including various bacterial products, bile acids, cytokines, nitric oxide, and endotoxins, hence the role in albumin dialysis. The next option is the renal replacement therapy. So when do we do RRT in HRS? So what are the indications? Those who are unresponsive to pharmacological treatment and any conventional indications for RRT, that is volume overload, uremia, electrolyte imbalances, or as a bridging therapy to transplant. So the ideal timing and the best modality of RRT in the cirrhotic patient is not known. So the better would be to do a CRRT. Why? If the patient is hemodynamically unstable, or if the patient has hyperammonemia and encephalopathy. And coming to the cutoff values of ammonia in HRS for CRRT is not known. And the other modalities, as I told, MARS, so that albumin helps in removal of so many toxins. The next is TIPS. If you remember, I told TIPS as a risk factor also. So now how TIPS helps in the treatment also we'll know. So TIPS is nothing but it connects the portal vein with one of the hepatic veins. Theoretically, it improves the kidney functions in HRS by decreasing portal hypertension and reducing and reversing the hemodynamic changes that precipitate the HRS. Also, it improves serum creatinine, serum sodium, and urine output. But one thing you should keep in mind, the relative liver ischemia that immediately follows TIPS insertion could potentiate the hepatic failure and also predispose to severe liver dysfunction. There is one recent trial which is still ongoing, the Liver Hero trial, okay, which is actually seeing the HRS AKI treatment with TIPS and whether standard therapy of terlipressin and albumin. The results are still awaited. The last option is the liver transplant. So as we know, liver transplant remains the definitive treatment for HRS, but whether to do a liver transplant or liver with kidney transplantation is a decision that you have to take on an individual basis. So coming to the US guidelines, which says that liver kidney transplantation should be done in a patient with EGFR of less than or equal to 25 ml per minute, or a patient who is on renal replacement therapy for more than 6 weeks, or in the presence of CKD stage 3 with any comorbid presence of metabolic diseases. Coming to the European guidelines, they tell that combined transplantation should be done in patients with CKD stage 4 or 5, or cases of patients requiring renal replacement therapy for more than 8 to 12 weeks, or if the biopsy sample reveals greater than 30% glomerulosclerosis and fibrosis. So this is about HRS. So basically you should know the definition, the risk factors, important is the pathophysiology and the management, which are broad headlines are 5. Now next I'll be discussing about acute acalculous cholecystitis. Any questions, please post it in the chat. So acute acalculous cholecystitis, I think this question was not asked recently, but it has been asked multiple times in FNB exams previously. So we will be discussing about the etiology, the pathophysiology, the clinical manifestations, and the management. So what is acute acalculous cholecystitis, also known as AAC? So it is nothing but an acute necroinflammatory disease of the gallbladder with multifactorial pathogenesis, but in the absence of 3 important things. One is cholelithiasis, sludge, or cystic duct obstruction. So this is associated with high morbidity and mortality. And coming to the etiologies, there are two etiologies. One is as a complication of a severe acute conditions like acute AML, severe burns, shock, aortic dissection, or TPN, or as a secondary infection of gallbladder during systemic sepsis, like disseminated candidiasis, gram-negative sepsis, or any tropical illness, chronic biliary tract carriers of Salmonella, cholera, TB, ascariasis, and any viral infections like CBV, EMV, hepatitis A and B. Coming to the pathogenesis, there are four important pathogenesis mechanisms. The most important one is the gallbladder wall ischemia. So how does this occur? This can be secondary to hypotension, dehydration, or due to vasoactive drug administration. All these things lead to prolonged ischemia, which is associated with release of free radicals, which causes microvascular thrombosis of both arterial and venous vessels, leading to necrosis and perforation. The second mechanism is the biliary stasis or the sludge. So this occurs as a result of dehydration. So due to dehydration, there is volume depletion, which leads to increase in bile concentration in the blood. So in the absence of stimulus for GB emptying, this may lead to cystic duct obstruction, leading to biliary stasis, and microlith formation, leading to mucosal injury. The third mechanism is vasoactive mediators. So this occurs especially in our ICUs. We most commonly see this in gram-negative sepsis. So in gram-negative sepsis, there is release of mediators such as lipopolysaccharides and platelet activating factors, which leads to splanchnic hypoperfusion and GB ischemia. And the last one, infections itself, which may lead to cholangiopathies and lead to GB wall edema. Coming to the clinical manifestations. So as we know, most of the cases of acalculous cholecystitis are not discovered till the complications arises like gangrenous cholecystitis or GB perforation. So diagnosis is often delayed as pain and tenderness is seen in less than 30% of, it is absent in 30% of patients of acalculous cholecystitis. In 70% of patients, they may present with fever, leukocytosis, hyperbilirubinemia, hypotension, and multi-organ failure. Coming to the diagnostic approach. So any critically ill patients with sepsis without a clear source of jaundice or any patient with a post-operative jaundice, he should be suspected as acalculous cholecystitis. And when you suspect, you do some lab investigations like complete blood count, serum electrolytes, LFTs, pancreatic enzymes to rule out pancreatitis, and urine analysis and the chest X-ray. So in around 90% of cases, the blood cultures are positive and most common organisms are the GNVs. And after the lab evaluation, you go to a definitive modality, that is the ultrasound, where you can see that the gallbladder wall thickness increases. Normally it is 2 to 3 mm. Here it might increase to 3.5 to 4 mm. And there could be a sonographic Murphy sign, pericholecystic fluid or submucosal edema, intramural gas, and echogenic bile. In case of inconclusive USG, but you are still has a high suspicion of acalculous cholecystitis, then you do a CECG abdomen. Coming to the differential diagnosis, so it is acute calculous cholecystitis, acute pancreatitis, hepatic or subphrenic abscesses, and right-sided pyelonephritis. So how do you manage? So you have confirmed that there is a calculous cholecystitis and abdominal imaging. So you do a supportive care. How do you do it? By giving intravenous fluids, correction of electrolyte abnormalities, and pain control. And start with empirical antibiotics. So basically these antibiotics should be started to cover the Enterobacteriaceae and Pseudomonas. So you start usually with Piptaz or Meropenem. And if there is a risk for MRSA, add vancomycin. And after that, after the supportive care and the antibiotics, you have to see three things in the abdominal imaging. One is GB necrosis, emphysematous gallbladder, or GB perforation. If that is present, then you have to take for an emergency cholecystectomy. If that is not the case, then you have to do percutaneous GB then you have to do percutaneous GB drainage. Or if emergency cholecystectomy is not possible as the patient is in requiring higher vasopressor support on a higher ventilator support, then that is the time you can also do a percutaneous GB drainage. So if there is any failure to improve within 24 to 48 hours, then you have to take the patients for an emergency cholecystectomy. If the patient improves with the percutaneous GB drainage, they have to continue antibiotics and perform a USG abdomen to rule out for any gallstones or sludge. If yes, you have to plan for an elective cholecystectomy. If no, then you can remove the cholecystectomy tube when the drainage is very minimal, that is less than 10 ml. Thank you. So Bhuvana, will you continue with your other topics?